Today on BRStv, we have a quick review of everything that we learned from our WWC tank tours, combined with a bit of vision into what the rest of the series will look like, as well as continuing to give away that $20,000 dream tank at the end. Want a tank like this one that we're building? Here it is. Hey, I'm Ryan, your host of BRStv. This week we have episode 5 of the BRS WWC hybrid system. In this series, we're developing a method of dealing with almost every major reefing topic and assembling them into one cohesive system that, above all else, is simple and stable. This hybrid system will also address a variety of budgets and skill levels that most reefers will be able to follow and expect to achieve very similar results. Hopefully exploring these methods in a manner where, regardless of your experience level in the hobby, learn something new and use WWC and BRS teams' experiences to refine our knowledge. Today is going to be two things: an overview of the WWC tank recipes that we learned from their team. This is a result of 2 16-hour days learning everything that we can, countless emails, texts, and phone calls, combined with their team flying up here to really nail all this down. Throughout the series, we'll dive deeper into not just the how, but the why of each major topic. And for today, we're going to keep it somewhat brief, followed with exactly what you can expect to see in this series and how it applies to a home environment. So to start this off, what you saw in the last few weeks is two things: 2 SPS dominant tanks. There may be some other corals in the 500 and 900, but these tanks are currently set up for one purpose: growing wall-to-wall SPS colonies with awesome coloration and health. Really many people's dream tank. The 293, however, is set up for a mixed tank of LPS and SPS, which is much more common. I just want to share right off the bat that while mixed tanks are much more popular than SPS dominant tanks, both of our teams universally agree that a mixed tank is much harder to achieve the best results with than an SPS only tank. That's because you're mixing corals found at 40 feet with those found at 10 feet, which in nature have very different flow, lighting, and nutrient needs. So a mixed tank is less about finding the ideal solutions for each and much more about finding the middle ground between the two, as well as attempting to create the zones in the tank that fit the different coral type needs. I share this just because I think many newer reefers think of SPS as the most difficult, when in fact the mixed tank that they're about to embark on is much more difficult. On a scale of 1 to 10, from easiest tanks to hardest, I'd say polyp tanks like zoanthids and mushrooms are like a 2 to 3, softy tanks maybe only slightly harder. LPS tanks have a few additional needs and maybe a 4 to 5. SPS tanks require more attention to a variety of factors and like a 6 or 7. But a mixed reef with all of these corals really requires all 4 skills, knowing just not what they need, but how to provide it, and ultimately why a mixed tank can be an 8 to 10 difficulty to set up properly. Probably also somewhat related to the strong learning curve for newer reefers. So if I had one piece of advice for newer reefers, it would be attempt to stick to one of these types of coral, learn from the success and challenges, and then follow that type of progression path towards the more difficult tank types. So with that in mind, this is what I saw as the WWC recipe for filtration, lighting, flow, the cycle, chemistry, coral nutrition, and the maintenance rhythm. This is the essence of a successful reef tank. If you get this right, a vast majority of reefers will be successful. Starting with filtration and flow, because they're fairly closely intertwined. One of the things that you're going to hear from the WWC team over and over is a strong preference for established live rock and high flow. Established rock being the #1 focus for filtration. The older, the better. Just a strong belief that old, established rock is the core of a successful reef tank. Any negatives associated with old live rock greatly outweighed by the stability aspects. You'll also see that they will never set up an SPS tank with sand. Sand can be a huge component of filtration in many tanks. We both believe that there is a strong argument to be made that the sand bed may actually be a bigger component of biological filtration than the rock, due to the surface area of the small grains, as well as a type of filtration that happens below the surface of the sand. That said, you will never find sand in a WWC SPS tank for 2 major reasons. First, well, sand can be a component of an easier to set up tank and much more stable in the beginning. Over time, it can collect or produce all kinds of undesirable pollutants in the tank. This is something that you can see by going to the corner of an established reef tank sand bed, stirring it up, and you will likely see a cloud that most reefers would likely prefer was not in the tank. Without the sand bed, you can use flow, filtration, and maintenance to keep all of that crud out of the tank rather than let it settle out and accumulate in the sand bed. The way the WWC team put it to me was the first 8 months to a year of the bare bottom tank will be much more difficult because it's just less biologically stable without the sand. However, after that, the bare bottom tank will be much more stable because it doesn't have the accumulation issues that sand has. Meaning after the first 8 to 12 months and every year after that, the bare bottom is likely to avoid all kinds of issues and be a lot easier. A little effort and patience on the front end pays off in the long term. However, much more than that, it's literally impossible to provide the kind of flow that they want to put in a tank that has sand. It's their team's assertion that flow is more important than a vast majority of system design elements, including lighting. Flow is the #1 most critical component for an SPS coral's biological process. Varied flow just not only serving as a pumping mechanism for biological processes within the coral's tissue, but also ridding itself of excess CO2, harmful byproducts of photosynthesis like oxidants, and gas exchange or element transfer through the coral's boundary layer. In the end, there's a close relationship between lighting, flow, and nutrient availability. If you scale one up, there'll be even more benefit if you scale the others up with it. And sometimes one can be a limiting factor or even harmful if it's not scaled up with the others. In this case, I would say increasing lighting intensity or length of the photo period will almost always be even more successful if flow is properly scaled up with it. So how much flow is enough? Reefers often say things like 30 to 50x turnover, but we're seeing a lot of tanks capable of 70 to 100 these days. Keep in mind that today's implementations rarely have all pumps turned on to max all at once. So pumps on a wave maker or DC pumps are capable of 70 to 100x turnover, are much more likely producing 35 to 50 at any given point, as half the pumps are either off or in the low flow position. So I think it's important to note here that there are obviously tons of successful SPS dominant tanks out there with sand, many of which I'd also call dream tank quality, including WWC's 293, which has sand and much less flow. No one would call this the wrong way to do this, and almost anyone would be ecstatic with the results. However, while the 293 mixed tank is an amazing tank, if you look at the SPS coloration and growth on this tank versus the higher flow and par bare bottom 500 SPS tank right next to it, there's no question there's a large incremental increase in coloration in both the 500 and 900. I would also say almost every commercial facility that I run into where caring for these animals goes beyond just a hobby, and the growth and coloration results are also financially motivated. Almost all of them are going bare bottom with near ridiculous amounts of flow. Very few of them are focused on perfecting lighting, but most are always perfecting flow. Outside of that, there are a few other simple elements related to filtration, the use of carbon to remove color pigments, organics and other contaminants from the tank, filter pads or socks to remove undesirable waste, and floating particulates from the water. These pads are changed out 2 times a week, which matches some data from BRStv Investigates on how frequently the filter socks and pads do need to be changed to be effective. They also run easy-to-access recirculating external skimmers to remove excess waste, as well as promote increased gas exchange. Preference being AC pump skimmers because they are more reliable. WWC has expressed a particular fondness of the Super Reef and SRO line of skimmers from Reef Octopus, which use that AC bubble blaster pumps. They just work and last a long time without consistent need of maintenance, something that the BRS team and I agree with entirely. Somewhat related to filtration is a cycle. Most reefers are in search for an instant tank. Get water and corals into it as soon as possible, which can certainly be done. But WWC is a firm believer in long cycles for SPS tanks, at least a 4-month cycle, 3 months of which is done without light. Cycle here meaning more than just a fish cycle, but meaning something more inclusive to the entire biological process happening in the tank, which is going to make it more stable for sensitive animals like SPS corals. You can argue that it can be done faster, but I think almost everyone will agree that initial success rates increase linearly with the length of the cycle. Throughout this series, we have seen some mentions in the comments that no one would have that kind of patience, and a 4-month cycle is just too long. I would like to just point out that we're not talking about an average first tank here. SPS corals are amongst the most sensitive and receive the most benefit from tank stability. So I think the 4 months, 3 months without light is a good recommendation for most reefers looking to start a new SPS tank and ensure the highest success rates. Frankly, some might even recommend longer, particularly if you're going bare bottom. Next, looking at lighting, this is an interesting topic because it's probably one of the most debated topics and one of the elements of reefing that the most reefers are having the most mortalities and catastrophic failures with. Yet at the same time, this was and should be one of the easiest things on the entire tank. That's because all that's required to be successful here is a highly diffused light source that covers a wide area of light with the right spectrum. That's as simple as plugging a bank of proven T5s or halide bulbs with proper reflectors into the wall and walking away. This is what the WWC team relied on for a very long time. There's no question that the T5s and the halides met their simple and stable approach goals. However, the lighting conversation has largely changed from how do I provide proper light to the reef tank, which was pretty easy, to how do I use LEDs to light a reef tank. Note the not so subtle difference there. One is how do I support the biological need for my corals, and the other is how do I use one very specific technology to do this. Unless you own stock in LED companies, that might not be the wisest approach, especially because the nature of LEDs is they're small, compact light sources, which is pretty far from the highly diffused, very difficult to shadow, even light source of a vast majority of reef tanks we're using prior to using LEDs. That said, LEDs come with all kinds of advantages: dimming, limited heat, energy efficiency, no bulb changes, they're low profile, compact, and attractive. They have phone apps, slider bars, and all kinds of cool features which mean LEDs are here to stay and certainly the future. It's pretty easy to implement them for most types of tanks. It's how do we use them for high density SPS tanks? That's an important note. It's a lot easier to use LEDs on a mixed tank or other tank types because even coverage and shadowing just isn't as big of an issue as it is with an SPS dominant tank like these, particularly if your goal is to grow larger density pack SPS colonies, which at the 2 to 3 year mark don't shadow their neighbors and also don't shadow themselves. So the WWC team feels exactly the same. They want the advantages of the LEDs, but the goal isn't use LEDs at all costs. It's light the tank properly and use technology to do it in a manner which meets their simple and stable goals. Their solution is to use the T5 Radion LED hybrid on both the 500 and 900 SPS tanks, using LEDs as the primary light, and then using the T5s as the fill light in between them to eliminate shadows, hot spots, and support proper growth. They also raise the lights up to 1.5 feet to nearly 2 feet above the tank, which is double to triple the 8-inch height that most reefers are mounting them on at home. Mounting the LEDs that high not only evens the intensity out over a larger area, but allows the spectrum from the individual LEDs to blend together into something more cohesive. They then use a par meter to tune all of this, so the par is largely in that 150 to 350 par range for the morning, and then slightly lower for the rest of the day. There was no universe where they were going to turn on all of this light, slide the sliders until it looks good to the eye, and then call it a day. There's just too much invested in these tanks to rely on guesses and luck. On the Mixed Reef 293, where we're balancing the SPS corals with the LPS corals, the story is a bit different. On this tank, they went LED only with diffused Radion XR15s, still mounted higher than most, but still closer to the water's surface than the SPS tanks, spaced properly over the tank, and then tuned to a lower par range. This mixed tank style with less densely packed SPS tanks just has a more limited lighting demand, and in some ways, easier to light properly, but the par range is still controlled and done via a par meter, not just flipping switches and guessing. This is a pretty critical point to understand here because there are 20 times as many mixed tanks out there than there are high-density SPS tanks. This grid of 6 XR15s on nearly a 300-gallon tank is producing awesome results for a wide range of corals. I would note that by using 6 XR15s rather than 3 XR30s, they're able to spread the light out over a larger area, but at the same cost. The WWC team did share with me that if this tank was going to be transitioned to a high-density SPS only tank, they would add a third row of XR15s and raise the lights up a bit, or attempt to add some T5s for fill light. So all that said, since most of today's lighting solutions are really not just plug and play anymore, most of the reefers are reliant on instinct, research, and trial and error often with a few expensive mortalities, or buying a par meter, and at $400 to $500 a par meter is really out of the question for most reefers. Double so because you might only use it for a couple weeks. As long as you have the ability to plug it into a Windows laptop or PC, the Senai and USB Apogee is much more affordable option at about $200, or Neptune's PMK at $300. But even at that price, it's pretty high, and because of that, I'm trying to get the team here to find a way to rent handheld apogee meters, which are the easiest to use and make proper lighting setup more available to the average reefer. Maybe all of you could share in the comments or a reef-to-reef thread if you would value the ability to rent a meter like this. Really, most people are only going to need the meter for a few weeks to tweak some settings, watch how the tank responds, and get it right. Hopefully a low-cost rental service like this could make it more accessible to more reefers. I don't want to present a par meter as 100% critical, but with LEDs and newer to intermediate reefers, the success rates will skyrocket if we're lighting the tanks intelligently with a defined goal rather than just guessing. Moving on to how the WWC teams to approach chemistry. They don't get too fancy, they keep it simple and stable above all else. A DK to 8.6, calcium at 480, and magnesium at 1440. There's no rocket science to these levels. They're just designed to be a bit elevated, which allows for the inevitable mistakes over time. For instance, it is pretty easy for an SPS system to drop a full DKH in a single day if something goes wrong, and it will eventually, so that 8.6 DKH keeps you away from that danger level of dropping below 7. In the end, I don't think there's any sound science that these levels are going to answer the unicorn hunt to best or perfect levels, but there's no denying the results. If you maintain these levels stably, I think most reefers will universally agree that major element chemistry will not prevent success with your tank. These levels are maintained with a calcium reactor and partially with Brightwell's Magnesion P in all 3 tanks, partially because a calcium reactor is the most cost-effective solution for tanks this size, but also because the calcium reactors presumably replenish various minor and trace elements. In that spirit, the approach to maintaining all of the minor and trace elements is just the calcium reactor and 10 to 15% water changes weekly. Presumably, some elements are partially depleted this way, and the team does acknowledge that there may be some benefit to maintaining minor and trace elements more precisely, but they also don't want to play mad scientist with dozens of trace element bottles, and that process would deviate drastically from their keep it simple and stable approach. In the end, I tend to agree that that is simple and stable, and the approach is more likely to produce 10-year successful tanks just because it is simple and harder to mess up catastrophically. Moving on to coral nutrition, often referred to as nutrients in reefing. I have to say it's pretty refreshing to discuss this with some like-minded individuals. Both of our teams dislike how the industry uses the word nutrients because in a vast majority of instances that only means nitrate and phosphate to reefers. While nitrate and phosphate are nutrients, that's just a small part of the overall coral nutrition. The corals are capable of providing a vast majority of the energy they need from light and water alone. However, they do benefit from sources of protein, building blocks of protein with amino acids, as well as nitrogen and phosphorus. This is going to be a much longer conversation in a future episode, but the WWC team doesn't spend a lot of time concerning themselves with nitrate and phosphate. Other than they do like to keep it under around 20 parts per million nitrate and 0.1 parts per million phosphate. It's not that those numbers are the goal in any way, just significantly over that is probably a bad idea in terms of coral calcification and pest organisms. The 20 parts per million nitrate is more just where the tank ended up and stabilized around more than an actual goal. If it had stabilized around 10 parts per million, they shared that there's no chance that they would dose nitrate to get it up. And as long as it's not above 20, they're not going to do much to get it down either. The only real thing the WWC team focuses on in terms of nutrients is protein input and to a lesser degree amino acids, all provided with their store-made food, which is largely food-processed fish, amino acids, and particulate foods like reefroids mixed together. This food is fed by the staff on the hour, every hour. Literally, there's an alarm in the back that goes off every hour, and they walk around and feed every tank on the hour during the day when the lights are on. Again, talking to them, there's zero talk about nitrate and phosphate, only protein input. This was something that we tried pretty hard to get across in the BRS 160 series as well, with the 2 cubes of mysis, 2 cubes of calanus, 2 cubes of cyclopods, algae extreme pellets, reef chili, KZ amino acids fed every day. There's a ton of protein and healthy fat-based nutrition being added to the tank every day, but in our case, very low nitrate and phosphate. It's more about complete nutritive input than it is about resulting nitrate and phosphate levels in the tank. In fact, when their team was up here in Minnesota going over all of this, I made a commitment to them that I'm going to do my best to never use the word nutrients again, just because it's not clear what that means to many reefers. From here on out, I'm going to do my best to use the word nutrition rather than nutrients, because that includes things like protein and amino acids, which is more encompassing and helpful. When talking about nitrate and phosphate, directly use those words specifically. When talking about protein and healthy fats, use those words specifically instead. Just to bring this home, the WWC team also strongly believes that there's a direct correlation between lighting and the coral nutrition and even flow. If you increase the amount of light, either intensity of the lights or length that they're on, it will increase the amount of energy the coral produces. In turn, if the coral has additional energy, it will likely benefit from additional protein availability at the same time. So light increases are not always, but often done in conjunction with protein increases, if possible even flow increases as well, to help the coral with the additional gas exchange. Notice there's no mention of nitrate or phosphate in any of that. It's not that a tank can't be nitrate or phosphate deficient or achieve benefits associated with higher or lower levels, just that if we focus on various forms of protein input, it's unlikely that nitrate or phosphate will be low enough to be an issue. Keep in mind that as long as nitrate and phosphate levels are consistently above 0, it will always be much higher and more available than in a vast majority of natural coral reefs. So some of you are asking, what's going on here? Did he just say 0.1 or 0.01 phosphate, and rather than 20 parts per million nitrate, did he mean 0.2? I think that's because the hobby has been after as low of nitrate and phosphate levels as possible, because historically it's been so hard to maintain low levels, and there are so many issues with pest organisms that often go away with lower levels. However, now with properly designed refugiums, algae scrubbers, and various carbon dosing options, it's become very easy to maintain lower levels. Some would even say too low. So please remember, this is never about one extreme or another. For most reefers, it's about balance. Finding the right nutritive input that promotes healthy corals but doesn't cause other issues in the tank. In that spirit, I want to state that feeding tons of protein hourly or allowing high nitrate and phosphate levels like this is not something the BRS or WWC team would recommend to most reefers, particularly newer tanks. The reason why this is working here in the WWC 500, 900, and 293 is because these are robust tanks that have huge nutritional uptake and can handle, even benefit from, that additional protein input. These are also robust, stable tanks with an incredible amount of herbivorous fish called the tang gang, as well as a well-developed microfauna population grazing on the algae all the time. This level of nutritive input is not the kind of thing that either team would recommend someone go out and immediately implement. And if you do ignore this warning, don't be surprised if you see an almost immediate algae, cyano, dino, or other pest outbreak. It's about balance and understanding the nutritive input for the stage of your tank. The last piece here is the maintenance rhythm. The one thing the WWC team does without fail is maintenance. On time, every time. Water changes are never missed. Pumps are cleaned when they look dirty, not when they stop working. Glass is cleaned daily. Filter pads are changed twice a week. Carbon change on time, hourly feeding. This is probably just going to be one of the harder elements for the average reefer to follow as well as at home. But the goal here is stable. And part of stable is doing things on time to prevent issues rather than treat them after the fact. Okay, so that leads into why we're sharing that BRS WWC hybrid method rather than just sharing straight up do what WWC does. Well, for those who can, I'd say follow WWC recipe exactly and find success almost certainly. Fact is, a home environment and a business environment are just different. One has employees tending to things 12 hours a day, often very large volumes of water, and doesn't have common concerns like noise or vacations. So the hybrid method is going to meet the WWC requirements that it needs to be simple and stable at all costs. Simple meaning that you don't have to be an electrical engineer or marine biologist to produce results. No unnecessary equipment or complexities. Stable meaning equipment is chosen based on reliability over features, relies on time-tested proven methods, elimination of failure points, and over-reliance on technology. In addition to that, to meet BRS requirements, the method needs to be applicable to a home or office environment, meaning that it respects that reefers work, sleep, and travel, so we're frequently away from the tank. The system has a reasonable amount of maintenance for a home environment and needs to be reasonably quiet and attractive. We also want to fulfill the commitment to building a hybrid system that will also address a variety of budgets and skill levels most reefers can follow and expect to achieve very similar results. In that spirit, we're going to attempt to offer 3 options in each case: an option where low cost is a priority, common option, which is often that balance of cost and features, and a high-end option, which often costs double or triple, but comes with legit advantages for those that value or require them. Lastly, we're going to implement one option on the Red Sea XXL 750. This will probably be the high-end option, but in conjunction with that, we're also going to implement an option with something as small as a Red Sea E Series 170, which is a 37-gallon all-in-one convertible tank. Emphasis here will be low cost, simple and stable results in a reasonable sized tank with lower equipment investments. I can tell you both Zach and Jason here at BRS have been able to do it in 60-gallon cubes, so there's no reason that we can't do it here with the E170. Lastly, we're also going to convert the BRS 160 over to the new hybrid method, because showing the results of a brand new smaller and larger tank is one thing, but most of you already have tanks, so even more valuable will be how and why and what results we get from converting the BRS 160 over. So that's what you're going to see over the next 6 months or so: development of the BRS WWC method, and then more important than anything else, show you the legit results along the way. Following these 3 tanks and the evolution of the discussion will hopefully create a clear path to success for many reefers who are otherwise struggling with their SPS dominant tanks. Willing to put in the time, but not just finding the same successes as the WWC team has achieved. I will say there is an obvious monetary barrier with this many corals in the WWC tanks, but this is a hobby. For some, we'll be creating all of this overnight. For others, it's a many-year path watching the tank evolve with many larger colonies rather than tons of smaller colonies. Understanding that reefing isn't the cheapest hobby out there, this is the kind of tank that doesn't have to break the bank, just a component of a longer-term goal. However, for someone, it's going to be free because BRS, WWC, and the Reef to Reef community is giving away that $20,000 Dream Tank giveaway this month. So not only is all the gear free, but WWC is also giving away $5,000 in coral to stock it to the brim. It's a Red Sea XXL 750, which is one of the biggest tanks they make, chock full of Ecotech, Neptune, Octopus, BRS, and tons of other gear. So click that link in the lower right or head on over to the site and hit on free prizes to sign up. This week on Reef to Reef, we're asking, is there anything in particular that you would like to see us cover in detail in this series? A link to that thread is down in the description below. Next week, the first episode of the hybrid system with Filtration. So make sure to hit that subscribe button and the instant notification bell. If you like what we're doing here, let us know with a quick thumbs up. See you next week with another episode of BRStv.